conscious this can get a bit pointy with the terminology, so forgive me for trying to sort of dumb it down, if you like. This change, at the moment, you click on a news article after searching in Google, you get to the news article. Most of the revenue tends to end up with Google. So this, in all likelihood, this will change without Google having a choice about it.
Well, that's certainly the intention. What the ACCC pointed out in the detailed work they did, the Digital Platforms Inquiry, was that the digital platforms, Google and Facebook, are the unavoidable business partners of News Corp, Seven West Media, Nine Entertainment Limited, ABC, all of Australia's news media businesses. And yet, ordinarily in a commercial market, you would expect that there would be deals done as to the value of the content that is produced and paid for by news media businesses. Now, what Google and Facebook do very efficiently is they aggregate eyeballs, and those eyeballs are attracted to those sites because of the content. And yet, at the moment, there are not commercial deals in place. So this mandatory bargaining code is designed to make Google and Facebook sit down at the table with Australian news media businesses, big and small, 150,000 in revenue or higher, and come to a commercial agreement.
At the moment, they can do that. Essentially what generally happens, though, is, and let's use Google as an example, they try to come to agreement, the news companies aren't too happy with that split in revenue. So under this, if they can't agree, we have this final offer arbitration. Both parties put in, here's what we believe the split should be, and an independent panel chooses one of them. So that process will be final, and more importantly, it'll be truncated. It can't go on forever.
That's right. So there's 3 months for commercial negotiation and a 45-day period, 45 business days for an arbitration. It can be extended a little bit longer to deal with some information gathering requirements and so on, but very much a finite time period. And then, as you say, final offer arbitration. So each side puts in what it says the deal should be. This is used by, in various situations around the world. The Canadian radio and television regulator, for example, uses it. And the intention is that it gives both sides a very strong incentive for Google and Facebook not to really lowball their offer, and for the news media businesses not to go artificially high.
If either of them do that, they'll look like the silly offer.
That's right.
And the other one wins by default,
that's it.
Yeah.
Now, the other point to make, though, is we've got very strong incentives here for news media businesses and platforms to do commercial deals before ever needing to go to an arbitrator. And we've put in things in the most recent version of the code, the version that's being introduced just this morning by Treasurer Josh Frydenberg, so it'll be an amendment to the Competition and Consumer Act, which is a piece of Treasury legislation. But we've got incentives there. So, for example, the platforms can make what's called a standard offer. So that might well make sense in dealing with smaller organisations. Smaller organisations can also collectively bargain with the news media businesses. And it's very clear in the code that what a news media business and a platform can do is strike a commercial deal and contract between themselves that stands in substitution for going through the arbitration process. So that's
still open.
There's a strong incentive to do quick deals, commercial deals, certainty on both sides, and of course, getting certainty is a major motivator for commercial deals.
So as to what all this means, Google and Facebook have been hoovering up 81% of online advertising. Do you have a ballpark as to what that might end up once all of these agreements in place?
Look, a key principle here has been the minimum amount of regulatory intervention necessary to get commercial deals happening. So we don't think it's appropriate for government to be indicating prices or even specifying how the deals should be done. We've got media executives who are experts in this.
Right.
So let's get them at the table negotiating, but with that backstop that if they don't do a deal, then ultimately the arbitrator comes in and a deal will be imposed.
But that 81, I accept why you wouldn't want to put a number on it, despite my best efforts, but it would be significantly changed. This is meant to be major reform, right? I mean, if it ends up in the high 70s still, it's not going to make a big difference to the media.
I think the key point is it's not about changing the share of advertising revenue. It's about what is a fair proportion of the advertising revenue that Google or Facebook receives in the Australian market that ought to go to news media businesses who are in effect supplying content that is part of the reason people are going to Google and Facebook in the first place, and in turn, why they can capture these advertising revenues. And indeed, one of the principles in the code, one of the things that for the arbitrator to have regard to, is the cost of producing journalism.
So that's one of the key judgments. There is also a concession to tech giants, the so-called two-way value exchange. So this says there will be a benefit of Google and Facebook, ultimately meaning more people might end up on news sites. How will that value be assessed?
Well, again, the arbitrator will make a decision applying these criteria, but he or she will do that based upon the final offer that each site has put, and they too will weigh up the criteria. And so it's things like the value to the digital platforms of the content that the news media businesses have generated. But it's also the value the news media businesses get from what the digital platforms do.
Right.
And a separate criterion, as I've mentioned, the cost of journalism. These are all factors that will be in the mix. It's very clear under the code, by the way, payment can only go one way from the digital platforms to news media businesses.
I mean, the indication from that is the two-way value exchange. So the tech giants have got recognition that they're so good at their businesses, they drive people towards news companies, but that is dwarfed by all the work generating that content.
Well, exactly.
Just that premise, and is there an instruction to the independent arbiter here about value of journalism versus value of just generating something that spits someone towards that?
So the code sets out these factors for the two sides to weigh up as they determine what offer they'll put on the table, but also then for the arbitrator in determining which offer is to be preferred. And again, these are areas where news media businesses and digital platforms are the subject matter experts. So let's let them...
They'll put their case and
yes,
they'll try to say two-way, and Google will say, well, this is really valuable. The other company will say, no, well, hang on, it's not that valuable. We'd get a certain number of people anyway.
So let's be clear. What this does is it imposes a requirement on Facebook and Google to come to the table and negotiate commercially, knowing that if they can get a commercial deal, then it will never go to arbitration. But that if they don't, then the arbitrator will come in and set a price.
There were some veiled threats from big tech, some pushback on this, and maybe even talking about packing up shop from Australia. What are they saying to government now? Are they going to stay in the country?
Well, what they've indicated is that, first of all, they'll look at the detailed wording of the code, which is a reasonable thing for them to do, and that indeed is what everybody's saying. So as we speak, in fact, Treasurer Josh Frydenberg is in the House introducing the legislation, and so the full text of that will now be available.
Right.
Look, as the Prime Minister, Treasurer and I have observed at various points this year, it's not without precedent for large global digital businesses to talk about potentially exiting the market if there are laws they don't like. That's happened before, as the Prime Minister's observed. Amazon threatened to leave Australia when there were changes made to GST so that the previous exemption for transactions under $1,000 was removed, and all transactions digitally were subject to GST as all other transactions. So the point is, in that case, Amazon came back into the market. These kinds of things get said. We've worked hard to address what we think are the reasonable concerns of all stakeholders, including the digital platforms.
I mean, the tech companies have actually indicated they haven't seen the drafting and indicated to a degree as well they haven't really been kept in the loop. Is that accurate?
No, that's not accurate at all.
Right.
So they've seen two successive drafts.
So they should know this in pretty good detail.
They know the detail very well. And they'll see now the further draft today. Of course, it'll be referred to a Senate committee, so that'll be a further opportunity for all stakeholders to put further views, and senators will make their recommendations, which the government will consider as well. So there's been plenty of consultation. Okay. There's been a thorough process weighing up the concerns of all sides.
Communications Minister Paul Fletcher, appreciate your time today.